You experience time as a line. It moves in one direction, from past through present into future. Events happen, and then they are behind you. The future is ahead of you, not yet arrived. The present is where you stand. And this all feels so obviously true, so obviously the only way time could possibly be experienced, that it is difficult to even imagine an alternative. But the experience of time as a line, as a forward-moving arrow from past to future, is not a universal feature of human consciousness. It is a cultural construction, and it is a remarkably recent one. For most of human history, across most of the cultures that have ever existed, time was not experienced as a line. It was experienced as a cycle. The seasons returned. The rains came back. The dead were reborn. The ancestors lived again in their descendants. Events did not move away from you into an irretrievable past. They circled back. They repeated. They renewed. Understanding how profoundly different this way of experiencing time is from the modern linear model, and understanding what the shift from cyclical to linear time has done to the human mind and to human culture, is one of the most illuminating journeys you can take into what it actually means to be a human being, living in the particular moment of history that you inhabit. Let's begin with what time actually meant to the people who lived before written history. The anthropologist Mircea Eliade, in his landmark 1954 work, The Myth of the Eternal Return, documented a pattern that he found recurring across hunter-gatherer and early agricultural societies with remarkable consistency. What Eliade called the archaic ontology, the basic way of understanding reality in pre-modern cultures, was organized around the distinction between sacred time and profane time. Profane time was ordinary time, the time of everyday events, of eating and sleeping and working and talking. It moved forward in the ordinary sense. But sacred time was qualitatively different. It was the time of origins, the time when the world was first made, when the gods performed the acts that established the patterns. All subsequent events would repeat. And crucially, sacred time was not simply the past. It was eternally present. It could be accessed. It could be re-entered. This is what ritual was, in Eliade's analysis. Not a commemoration of something that had happened in the past, but a reenactment that made what had happened in the past present again. When the shaman performed the ritual, when the priest recited the words of creation, when the community danced the dance of the ancestors, they were not remembering. They were returning. Sacred time had no past. It was always now. The implications of this for how people actually experienced their lives were profound. In a culture organized around cyclical sacred time, nothing was truly lost. The dead were not gone. They had returned to the source from which new life would emerge. The winter was not the end of growth, but the preparation for its return. The drought was not a permanent deprivation, but part of a rhythm that would cycle back to abundance. Every ending was also a beginning. The ecological basis for this way of experiencing time is easy to understand. For most of human prehistory, and for most agricultural societies, the most important facts of life were cyclical. The seasons, the movements of celestial bodies that governed planting and harvesting, the flooding of rivers, the migrations of animals. Life was organized around the recognition and anticipation of these cycles. And the mind that evolved in that environment developed tools for perceiving and representing cyclical patterns. The archaeologist Alexander Marshack, working in the 1970s, argued that the first evidence of symbolic notation in human prehistory was not an attempt to represent quantities, but an attempt to track cycles. The notched bones and stones from the Upper Palaeolithic, dating back as far as 30,000 years, appeared to him to represent the phases of the moon, tracked across multiple months. The first human record-keeping was, in his interpretation, a record of cyclical time. The earliest calendars of agricultural civilizations were organized around cycles. The Egyptian calendar tracked the annual flooding of the Nile, the event around which the entire agricultural year was structured. The Mesopotamian calendar tracked the movements of celestial bodies. The Mayan calendar, one of the most sophisticated timekeeping systems ever developed, was not one calendar, but an interlocking system of multiple cycles of different lengths, producing patterns that repeated at intervals of hundreds of years. The Mayan relationship with time deserves particular attention because it illustrates so clearly how different a cyclical conception of time is from the linear one most modern people inhabit. For the Maya, Time was not a neutral medium through which events moved in one direction. Time had quality. Certain days were auspicious. Others were dangerous. A day of one kind had a character, a disposition, that shaped what happened on that day. And because time was cyclical, the character of a day in the past would return. The character of a distant day could be predicted. This is why Mayan priests were also astronomers and mathematicians. Knowing the character of time was a form of power. The ability to predict which days would be favorable for planting, for warfare, for marriage, for the birth of a ruler, was practical knowledge of the highest importance, and all of it was grounded in the assumption that time repeated. The transition from cyclical to linear time is one of the most important and least discussed shifts in human cognitive history, and it did not happen suddenly. It happened gradually, through a series of developments that each nudged the human conception of time in a more linear direction. The philosopher Karl Jaspers identified what he called the Axial Age, a period roughly from 800 to 200 BCE, in which, independently and more or less simultaneously, several major cultural traditions began to develop a new relationship with time. In ancient Israel, the prophets articulated a vision of history as moving toward a goal, a promised land, a coming kingdom, a messianic fulfillment. Time was no longer simply cycling, it was progressing, it had a direction, it was going somewhere. In ancient Greece, the pre-Socratic philosophers began conceiving of the cosmos as governed by natural laws that operated uniformly across time, rather than as a stage for the recurring actions of divine beings. Thucydides wrote the first history in the modern sense, a narrative of unique events that had happened once and would not happen again, aimed at understanding the causes of those unique events, rather than at revealing the recurring patterns they exemplified. In Zoroastrian Persia, a cosmic narrative emerged in which the forces of good and evil were engaged in a struggle that would end in a final victory, a transformation of the world that was qualitatively different from all that had come before. Time was not circular, but eschatological. It had an end that would be unlike its middle. What was happening across these diverse traditions was the emergence of a new relationship between human beings and time, a relationship in which particular events mattered in a way they had not mattered before. Because if time was cyclical, any particular event was ultimately just an instance of a recurring pattern. But if time was linear, moving toward a goal, then particular events were steps in an unrepeatable journey. They had meaning in relation to what came before and what would come after. The philosopher of history, Reinhard Koselleck, has argued that the specifically modern experience of time, the experience most people in the contemporary world take to be simply how time is, emerged fully only in the period between roughly 1500 and 1800 CE. It was during this period that what Koselleck calls the gap between the space of experience and the horizon of expectation opened up. In pre-modern societies, the future was expected to look more or less like the past. Experience was a reliable guide to what was coming. The farmer expected the seasons to return as they always had. The artisan expected to practice the craft their parents had practiced. The child expected to inhabit a world organized in roughly the same way as the world of their grandparents. But beginning in the early modern period, and accelerating through the scientific and industrial revolutions, this expectation broke down. The future began to be experienced as genuinely open, genuinely different from the past, genuinely unpredictable from the space of experience. The word progress, in its modern sense of forward movement toward an improved state, entered European languages as a temporal concept only in the 18th century. Before that, progress meant simply movement, without any implication of direction toward improvement. The clock was central to this transformation. The mechanical clock, which began to appear in European cities in the 13th and 14th centuries, introduced a way of measuring time that was abstract, uniform, and independent of any natural cycle. Before the clock, time was measured by the movements of the sun, the ringing of church bells, the rhythm of work and rest. It was local, variable, and embedded in the natural world. After the clock, time was a universal grid, the same everywhere, divisible into identical units, independent of any natural rhythm. The sociologist E.P. Thompson, in his famous 1967 essay Time, Work Discipline and Industrial Capitalism, documented the profound transformation in human temporal experience that accompanied the Industrial Revolution. Pre-industrial workers, Thompson argued, oriented their work around tasks rather than around clock time. You worked until the task was done. When the task was done, you rested. Work and life interpenetrated. There was no clear boundary between time and work. The factory system required something different. It required that workers arrive at a specific time and remain for a specific duration, regardless of whether the task was complete. It required that time be experienced as a scarce resource that could be spent or wasted. It required what Thompson called time thrift, the internalization of the discipline of the clock as a moral value. Being on time became a virtue. Wasting time became a vice. The Protestant work ethic, as Max Weber had analyzed it, was in part an ethic of temporal discipline, a sacralization of linear clock time. The psychologist Philip Zimbardo, in his research on time perspective, has documented the profound effects that different orientations toward time have on human behavior and well-being. People who are primarily past-oriented, who see themselves and their lives through the lens of what has already happened, tend toward nostalgia and conservatism. People who are primarily future-oriented, who evaluate present actions primarily through their consequences for the future, tend toward achievement and planning, but also toward anxiety and the difficulty of being present. People who are primarily present hedonistic, who focus primarily on current experience, tend toward pleasure and risk-taking, but also toward difficulty with delayed gratification. Zimbardo's research suggests that the optimal time perspective is a balanced one. But the modern world, structured around clock time, linear progress, and long-range planning, systematically biases people toward future orientation at the expense of present experience and the wisdom embedded in the past. The philosopher and cultural critic Ivan Illich argued in the 1970s that the colonization of time by the clock and by the logic of industrial productivity had produced a new form of poverty, time poverty, the experience of never having enough time, of always being behind, of time as a resource that is perpetually scarce and perpetually slipping away. This experience of time poverty is not universal. It is a product of a particular way of organizing human life around clock time and the imperative of productivity. Research across cultures has confirmed that the experience of time varies considerably. The anthropologist Edward Hall, in his studies of cultural differences in time perception, distinguished between monochronic cultures, which treat time as linear, divisible, and to be spent on one thing at a time, and polychronic cultures, which treat time as flexible, multiple things happening simultaneously, and relationships taking precedence over schedules. Hall found that monochronic cultures, which include most of Northern Europe and North America, tend to experience time as an independent variable that governs behavior. Polychronic cultures, which include most of the Middle East, Latin America, and Southern Europe, tend to experience time as subordinate to relationships and context. Neither way of experiencing time is more accurate. Both are cultural constructions. But when people from monochronic and polychronic cultures interact, the differences can produce profound misunderstandings, each side experiencing the other as either rigidly inhuman or frustratingly chaotic. What does all of this mean for how you experience your own life? The modern linear experience of time, the experience of time as a scarce resource moving in one direction from past to future, produces specific psychological consequences. It produces the experience of time pressure, the sense that there is never enough time. It produces nostalgia, the painful sense that the past is gone and cannot be recovered. It produces anxiety about the future, the worry that the approaching moment will not be what you need it to be. And it produces what the philosopher Martin Heidegger called the forgetfulness of being, the tendency to be so focused on past and future that the present moment, the only moment that actually exists, is experienced as a kind of narrow corridor to be moved through as quickly as possible on the way to somewhere else. The cyclical experience of time that characterized most of human history was not naive or primitive. It was adapted to a world in which the most important structures were genuinely cyclical, and it produced a relationship with time that was in some respects psychologically healthier than the linear model. Loss was not permanent. The past was not irretrievable. The present was not merely a point on a line, but a participant in a pattern that had meaning larger than any individual moment. You cannot step back into that world. The linear experience of time is too deeply embedded in the structures of modern life. In the clock, the calendar, the contract, the deadline, the mortgage, the retirement plan, the to-do list. These structures are not going away. But knowing that linear time is a cultural construction, rather than a universal truth of human experience, is itself a form of freedom. It opens the possibility of holding linear time more lightly, of recognizing that the sense of perpetual scarcity and forward pressure that modern time produces is not the only way time can be experienced, that the present moment is not merely a corridor but a destination, that the past is not simply gone, but continues to shape and inform and nourish what is happening now. The ancient world knew something about time that the modern world has largely forgotten, not that cyclical time is more real than linear time, but that the experience of living in the present moment, of participating in patterns larger than any individual event, of finding meaning in repetition and return, rather than only in progress and novelty, is available to human beings. It always has been. It still is. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribe for more content like this.